There's a lot to plan for if you're going to retire after age 65, but there's even more to plan for if you're going to retire before the age of 65. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know if you plan to retire before age 65. Hey everybody, I'm James Knoll, founder of Root Financial Partners, and I'm here to teach you what you need to know to create a secure retirement. So why is 65 the magic number here? Well, at age 65, you're eligible for Medicare. At age 65, you're not at full retirement age yet for Social Security, but you're pretty darn close. So when you're retiring after age 65, there's a whole lot more things that are further along or that are coming into play that aren't quite there yet if you retire before 65. So what are those things that you need to consider if you are going to retire before age 65? Well, number one is, do you have the right insurances? Insurances could be health insurance, life insurance, long-term care insurance. Let's explore why. With health insurance, as I mentioned, if you turn 65, you are eligible for Medicare. Assuming you have enough quarters of coverage, you're eligible for your Medicare benefit. But if you retire before 65, you are not yet eligible for Medicare. So in general, you have three high-level options. Number one, you can elect COBRA. COBRA is simply a continuation of a policy that you had through your employer. Now, not every employer offers this, but if your employer had more than 20 employees, and if your employer had an employer-sponsored healthcare plan, you may be eligible to elect COBRA for up to at least 18 months after retirement. What COBRA does is you are still paying for health insurance, but what is happening is you're getting the benefit, or you're getting the premium that your employer used to pay. You are now just responsible for 100% of it. So it's simply a continuation of coverage that you had with your previous employer, and you can have that for at least 18 months. That's one option. Another option is the health insurance marketplace. So you can go, and every state has their own exchange, and you can search for the right policy for you. What's going to give you the doctors that you want to have? What's going to give you the coverage that you want to have? What option is the best here? Usually it's best to work with a health insurance expert on this, but you have the health insurance marketplace where you can determine what's best for you. Now, another important aspect of that is you can get a subsidized version of that marketplace plan. The rules state that if your income is under 400% of the federal poverty limit, and that limit is different based upon if you're a household size of 1 or 2 or 4, or however many you have in your household, but if you're under 400% of the federal poverty limit, you may qualify for health insurance subsidy. Now, this is important for people who retire before 65, because if you have multiple types of accounts, say an IRA and a Roth IRA and a brokerage account, you can choose how you pull money from those accounts to keep your taxable income under certain thresholds. So you may want to implement a strategy where do you pull accounts from the right places to keep your income low enough to qualify for a subsidy. One important planning piece there is you also have to understand whether Roth conversions are part of your plan. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but if Roth conversions are part of your plan, then there's a decision you need to make. Do we keep income low so we can qualify for a health insurance subsidy? Or do we keep income low so we can implement a Roth conversion, but then that Roth conversion may very well put you over that 400% of the federal poverty level limit, which thereby eliminates your ability to qualify for a subsidy. So just different considerations there, but health insurance is a very important one, at least until age 65 when you qualify for Medicare. The next insurance coverage that you need to ensure you have in place is life insurance. Now, life insurance is something that you may or may not have, and really what it comes down to is your needs. And your needs are largely determined based upon what income sources you're going to have in retirement. So in this specific example, or in this specific case, when it comes to life insurance, you need to understand the impact of one spouse predeceasing the other. What impact would that have on the surviving spouse? Let's say, for example, you and a spouse retire. And just to keep it simple, you have no Social Security and no pension, no outside income sources. You're living entirely on savings and investments. And you've determined that you have enough in savings and investments to fully cover your needs. Well, if one of you dies, the other spouse still retains all those savings and investments. So your income doesn't necessarily change, which means if you had enough for the both of you, you probably have enough for just the one of you, meaning you maybe don't need life insurance in that case. Now compare that to someone who retires and they don't have a whole lot of savings or investments. And let's assume that they're retiring because one spouse has a strong pension from their employer, but that pension doesn't have any survivorship benefits. So if that pension is covering all of their needs and the spouse that has the pension passes away first, what would happen to the surviving spouse? if there would no longer be income, or if there would not be resources for that surviving spouse to continue living, that's maybe where you might need a life insurance policy. Now, a life insurance policy isn't the only way to do it. Could you keep working, or could you save more? Could you implement other things to make sure the surviving spouse is cared for? But life insurance is certainly an option. A lot of people in retirement don't need it. They're essentially self-insured. They have enough in income that has survivor benefits, or they have enough in savings or assets that would pass to the surviving spouse, that if one spouse passed away, it would be a tragedy, but it would not leave the other financially unable to meet their needs. So that's how you want to think about life insurance coverage, especially if you're going to retire before 65, because you may not have Social Security or certain pensions or certain things that have kicked in quite yet, and because you have a much longer time horizon that you're planning for in your retirement if you're retiring before 65. Now, long-term care insurance is the last part of insurance here. It's important whether you retire after 65 or before 65. And it's not necessarily important that every single person must have it, but it's important to the extent that every single person should understand how they would fund a potential long-term care event. Whether that's self-funding through investments or savings or assets like real estate, or whether it's insuring through a long-term care insurance policy. The reason this is even more important if you retire before 65 is if you retire at 60 or 55 even, there's a lot more years that you have to potentially spend down your assets before you might have a long-term care event. So if you're retiring at 70, say, and maybe there's a long-term care event in your late 70s or 80, you only have a few years that you could even potentially spend down your assets before that time comes. But if you retire at 55 and there's a long-term care event at 80, there's a lot more potential for you to spend down those assets. So that's where having that long-term care strategy in place, whether through self-insurance or self-funding versus buying a long-term care insurance policy, really makes a lot more sense. So that's the first thing that you need to look at, the insurance piece. Whether it's health insurance or life insurance or long-term care insurance, you don't necessarily need all of them, but you need to have a strategy in place for how are you going to fund potential health events or life events or long-term care events. The second piece that changes is your withdrawal strategy. So let's assume that you retire at 67, and let's assume that you and the spouse both have Social Security kick in. And when you retire, you know exactly what you want to live on. Social Security covers part of it, and then the remaining amount that comes from your portfolio. So that's pretty straightforward. You know what's coming in from Social Security, and then you have some withdrawal rate from your portfolio to fund the shortfall, and you let that carry you through the rest of your retirement. Now let's assume that you retire at 60. And let's assume that you're retiring at 60, but you're still going to take Social Security at age 67. What that means for you is much more of your living expense needs are going to need to come from your portfolio for those first 7 years. So do you have enough in your portfolio to fully fund the first 7 years? And then do you have enough after that to fund part of your retirement needs from age 67 and beyond? So in other words, if you're retiring early, there's a more likely scenario where your portfolio withdrawal rate is going to change. It's not going to stay at 3% or 4% or 5% or whatever you elect to structure your portfolio like to implement. It's not going to stay at one specific rate the whole time. It's likely going to start higher, and then it's going to vary as different income sources kick in. Or it's going to vary as expenses like health insurance are there for part of retirement, but then Medicare kicks in. Or it's going to vary as some expenses are higher up front, but maybe lesser, or maybe more later on in retirement. So how do you understand what withdrawal strategy needs to be implemented to fund those early years and also the later years when you do have full Social Security or a pension or other outside income sources? The third thing that needs to change if you're going to retire before age 65 is your Social Security strategy. Now, if you're going to retire past 65, you're probably not collecting Social Security early. There's an earnings limit, meaning if you're collecting Social Security early, say age 62, and you're earning over a certain threshold, Social Security starts to withhold those dollars that they're paying out to you. So for most people, if they're going to work until 65, 66, 67, beyond, they're not going to collect Social Security early because it just wouldn't make sense for them to do so. Now, if you're going to retire earlier than 65, you can collect Social Security as early as age 62. So does it make sense to collect Social Security early? Does it make sense to collect Social Security later, say at full retirement age or age 70 or somewhere in between there? That's something that you need to understand. And really, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, There was a podcast episode I did that said, does it make sense to collect Social Security early and invest it? A lot of people said, oh my gosh, you're not actually going to invest their money. Who collects Social Security just to turn around and invest it? Well, nobody does. But by collecting Social Security early, it's putting less pressure on your investments, meaning more of your investments can continue to grow. So the analysis is similar to that person who collected early and then invested their Social Security benefit. So understand, does that maybe make sense for you? Do you collect Social Security early? Which most people would say, oh my goodness, don't do that. The break-even age is if you live past 81 or whatever it is, you're gonna be better off delaying. There's a lot of truth to that. But at least consider the impact of if you do collect early, what does that mean for how much longer your portfolio might last because there's less pressure on it in those early years. Not saying that's for everybody, but it's certainly something to consider. If you aren't gonna collect early and you're gonna collect, say, at 67 or beyond, well, back to the last point, where's income going to come from for those first few years? Does one spouse maybe collect early to give you some income early on? Does another spouse delay so that you have one larger benefit that could potentially be a survivor benefit if one spouse predeceases the other? These are some more important questions if you're going to retire before 65 because you have more options as to how you're going to implement that Social Security plan. The fourth thing that you might want to look to change if you're going to retire before age 65 is your investment allocation. Let's just look at why. Let's assume that someone retires at age 70 and they're not healthy and they don't have longevity in their family versus someone who retires at age 55 who's very healthy, who has longevity in their family, whose portfolio is going to need to live or last longer. Well, this first portfolio for someone who's 70 and not very healthy and doesn't have longevity, it might only need to last for 10, 15 years or so looking at life expectancies. Versus this other individual, if they live until 95 and they retire at 55, that's 40 years worth of living expenses that need to be covered. So when you're in retirement, the major risks to your portfolio are twofold. There's multiple, but the two biggest that I see are the risk of market downturns. So how do you have a portfolio that you don't have to liquidate, you don't have to sell when the market takes a dip, as it always will, versus the risk of inflation? How do you make sure that your portfolio is continuing to grow to keep up with rising living expenses over the course of time? If you're going to retire early, and if you have a long life expectancy in front of you, that second risk, the risk of inflation, the risk of the erosion of your purchasing power, becomes a lot more risky. Just because inflation has a lot more years to potentially erode the value of those dollars in your portfolio. So how do you structure your portfolio in a way that, yes, you have income to meet your needs today, especially because you probably don't have Social Security, you maybe don't have a pension, you don't have those other income sources yet. How do you have enough in your portfolio to offset the ups and downs of the market, but also enough to last for potentially 30, 40 years or so over the course of your retirement? So make sure that if you're planning for an early retirement, are you updating your withdrawal strategy and really your investment allocation accordingly? And then finally, the fifth thing that you need to really consider or really need to look to adjust if you're going to retire before age 65, your tax strategy. So everyone has a tax planning window. I should say most people have a tax planning window. And that window is from the time that you retire until age 70 and 72. The reason for that is at 72, that's when required distributions kick in. And age 70, that's the longest time that you'll have until your Social Security benefit is maximized. So let's assume that someone retires and they don't collect their Social Security until age 70. Well, if they're going to retire early, their tax planning windows is maybe from age 60 to 70 if they don't collect any Social Security benefits, and then even more so age 72, where their income was here when they were working, and then they retire. And there's this valley, there's tax planning window where taxable income could potentially be very low, and then it's going to increase when Social Security kicks in, and it's going to increase when required minimum distributions kick in. So the time between retirement and those ages, that's your tax planning window. The earlier you retire, the broader that window becomes. So as you're retiring early, there often is more that you can do from a tax planning perspective because you have more years to control how you take income from your portfolio, to control are you doing conversions, to control what your portfolio is doing for you before you potentially hit, but before you do hit age 70 and 72, at which point Social Security would definitely kick in, as would your required minimum distributions. So because you have that window, it just becomes more important to understand how can we best take advantage of each one of these years in order to offset potential tax hits in the future from when required distributions kick in. So these are concerns that everyone should be planning for, whether it's insurances or investments or income or taxes. Everyone faces these planning points, but they become even more important if you're going to retire before 65. Now, if this video is helpful for you, here's another video that you might find valuable as you're looking to prepare for your own secure retirement. Thanks again for watching. This is James Knoll with the Root Financial Partners. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to share it with someone else who you think could find value from it. And also be sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this. And if you want more resources about how you can create a secure retirement, be sure to check out our podcast called Ready for Retirement. And finally, if you're interested in seeing how our services can help you create a secure retirement, check us out at rootfinancialpartners.com.